Welcome to Africa Ascending, a podcast series looking at key issues affecting the African business environment, and more particularly its impact on the insurance sector in Africa. Hosted by Afro-Asian Insurance Services and Africa Ahead, in this series we will be looking at everything from water regulations, currency devaluation, and climate change. To access this podcast in other ways, we will be appearing on Africa Ahead, www.afapublishing.com, Spotify, and on the media page of afroasian-insurance.com. My name is Liz Booth, and I am Editorial Director at Africa Ahead. With me, I have
Uday Patel, CEO of Afro-Asian Insurance Services.
In today's conversation, we ask whether insurers have a role to play in reducing corruption across Africa. According to the Africa Development Bank, corruption drains an estimated $10 billion annually from African economies, diverting crucial resources from healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The scale of these illicit financial flows undermines economic growth and erodes public trust in institutions across the continent. To consider this and why it matters, we have Jaco Jega, who was appointed the first chairperson of the then LOA Forensic Standing Committee in South Africa. In 2008, he was appointed the first CEO of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners South Africa chapter. We also have Paul Banoba, the Africa Regional Advisor and Lead for African Union Engagement at Transparency International Secretariat. He focuses on anti-corruption efforts and advocacy within the African Union. So welcome to you both. I think to start this conversation, we probably need to define corruption. Paul, can I ask you to start us off on that one?
It's a pleasure being here. Thanks so much for hosting us. Corruption has been defined by many institutions, and the most commonly advanced definition that many of us use is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, which means that somebody in a position of authority, a position of trust, diverts, misapplies resources, decisions for purposes of their own advancement or those close to them without due regard to what is set up by the institution that accords them that power.
And Jaco, would you give that the same definition, or would you add to that, do you think?
Yeah, so in short, it's the giving and receiving of a gratification to influence someone's actions dishonestly. And just for what do we see as gratification, there's various forms that this takes place in, is by receiving money or donations or votes or services or favors. So it's not only a physical monetary value that you receive. It can be in any form. And a lot of people think that if they receive a gift, that does not constitute corruption. As soon as you are influenced, and Paul's 100% right, as soon as you are influenced to do something quicker or illegally that you wouldn't have done in your normal job, or in the time frame that is there. Remember, if someone pays you to do something quicker than you usually would do it, that's also corruption because he's influencing you. Then it comes down to criminal activity, and that's corruption.
So what's the scale of the problem?
Well, if I can, insurance fraud globally is a massive problem. The FBI released figures now to say that in the US, related fraud, estimated fraud is $80 billion. In Canada, it's 1 billion, and that's only we're talking about the detectable. The UK is 1.1 billion. So if we look at the numbers that's applied, it's huge losses. Percentage-wise, looking at South Africa, so roughly 35% of all claims that's submitted is fraudulent claims. If we look at death claims, and fraudulent death claims for that matter, then it's about 75%. So massive losses that's being incurred by the insurance and that when it relates to fraud. But remember, corruption is but a subcategory of fraud. So now breaking it down from our side, if you read the report to the nations that's published by the ACFE International, which is compiled by certified fraud examiners, which is your professional experts, and globally, you would see that 64% of frauds being perpetrated by someone internally. Now, let that sink in. 64% of staff, or 64% of the fraud occurrences is being perpetrated by staff. And the people that's supposed to be your biggest asset is also your biggest risk. And that's where the thing of corruption comes in. And the loss ratio jumps up, because even if we look at fraud in general, we have categorized it in 3 pillars, if I can use the term pillars: financial statement fraud, corruption, which includes your bribery and all of that. You can have a look at our report to the nation, which also gives a quite clear fraud tree description with all the different types of fraud. And then lastly, asset misappropriation. Now, corruption is number 1 of all types of fraud. And that's not only us that say this. If you look at the same report to the nation, you look at the insurance industry and the different schemes, which consist out of billing, cash larceny, cash on hand, and EFT tampering. Corruption makes out 49% of all these schemes, which includes payroll and the rest. So huge problem that we sit in Africa with, but globally as well. So the same principle applies not only in Africa, but globally.
I think you've probably already answered the question about why it matters. I mean, I don't know, Paul, do you want to come back in and talk about why it's so important that we try and nail this problem and reduce those kind of numbers?
Absolutely. The burden on Africa is that a number of our governments, a number of our states are struggling to provide services to their people. And one of the biggest hurdles is just financing, having the right resources to deliver those services. In terms of global frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals, routinely we hear that the gap to achieve these targets in Africa remains the hardest. So resources are needed, they're not available, and yet we see that these resources are exiting the countries, exiting the continent through these illicit flows. Let me just add a few figures. So fairly recently, the UN Agency for Trade and Development gave us a figure of 88.6 billion that leave the continent Africa annually through illicit financial outflows. That figure, since then, this is a report of 2020, since then, other reports are indicating even higher figures. The estimates are really just increasing, and it's staggering, which basically then means that if these resources were available, a lot of progress in Africa could be seen on some of the key targets, and we're not seeing that progress because these resources are just departing.
So if I understand you correctly, in a nutshell, corruption and fraud increases the cost of doing business anywhere. And that's quite interesting for me because as a company, we are unique in the community of Lloyd's in that we are the only reinsurance broker focusing on Africa. And when we talk about doing insurance business in Africa, with some of our colleagues in the London market, and we ask them, why is it you're not investing? Why is it you're not setting up an operation in Africa when you're so interested in doing business in Africa? And they always say, to do that, our costs would probably be 30 to 50% higher than if we set up an operation elsewhere in other parts of the world. Do you not think that there is a bottom line financial cost to economic development in Africa because of this endemic problem?
Absolutely. So for many corporations, many companies, there will be some assessment to determine whether to enter a market. And if a jurisdiction has been determined as high risk, few people will stay away. Some will consider the cost and determine that, okay, we could go in, but some have exited later. Definitely. And one of the indices that the number of providers will watch is the grey listing from the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. And if a jurisdiction is grey listed, immediately there will be some impacts in the economy, in that market. And the companies trying to enter the market, the companies operating in that market will be impacted by the same. Compliance issues come in, and even just the cost of continuing operations. What is quite important to note is that a number of our large economies are actually currently sitting on the FATF grey list. If you look at Southern Africa, the biggest economy is South Africa. If you look at East Africa, Kenya, you look at Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, you go to West Africa, all the largest economies in these sub-regions are on the grey list, which then actually has an implication for operations, companies operating in these markets, and the cost of compliance itself.
So is this something that only government can solve, or does the responsibility lie at grassroots level?
Well, we've proven it over and over again. Corruption, yes, it's in a number of the countries that Paul just named. It's politicians that actually drive this. They make it difficult to work or to do business in a positive environment. So the cost is escalating, but it's actually the people that takes it on. So if you train the people on what's right and what's wrong. We've seen it over and over, and I'm going to use South Africa now as an example. I get asked a lot the question, are we more corrupted than those who governed the country in the past? And I would say, you know what, I think a lot of the times those who governed the country in the past were actually just more clever in hiding it, number one. And number two, the people were not that aware of what is corruption, what is fraud, and the different types. That's why we see nowadays on each and every newspaper, the frontline news, someone else stole, is because they get named and shamed. They get highlighted for the way that they live, their live standards. So if you train people, if you drive good morals and values in the country, and that's the same in the business, that's actually where you make your difference. You need to get people to stand up against those who's running organizations that gives the directors to say, listen, pay a bribe to do certain business. We need to stop saying it's all right. Others are doing it. I need to do it as well. That's actually where you do it. And we've started at the grassroots. You say grassroots. We've started with children, 3 years to 9 years, having a board game now where we actually train children on what is right and wrong so that they can tell their father and mother, Daddy, don't pay a bribe to the traffic cop. Daddy, don't lie. We didn't have this TV when the insurance claim assessor comes and they want to assess an insurance claim. So that is the type of things that drive good morals and values. We've done this now in school level. We started now at university level. There's a lot of new qualifications that we've actually linked in ethics and forensics into the curriculum. So the more and more people stand up against fraud, the more difficult it becomes to commit fraud and to get by it. You will always get it. And it doesn't matter. It's not only Africa that suffers and that's got a problem. I've heard what Udai's indicated. Yes, the cost of working in an economic environment might be higher here in Africa, but the same applies in other countries like Mexico and the rest. So every country's got its problems. You need to be able to manage and work around it. You need to be able to say no. A very good example is Elon Musk when he wanted to come to Africa, and he said that I'll introduce Starlink to the continent. Some countries embraced it. They've done business with Elon. They upskilled their people. They actually provided them with benefits. South Africa on the other side said, no, we want a piece of your pie. And he just said, no, I don't do business in South Africa, and he stopped that. The same needs to happen with other business people. We don't want to only hear that, yes, the cost to do business is 35 to 50% higher. We want the people to actually, the businesses to speak up and say, listen, this is why I don't do business in South Africa. Get it into the media so that everyone can see what they miss out on. Because there's so many good products out there that can provide benefits to Africa. But the person on the street don't know how they get deprived from all these things if it's not outspoken by the companies that wants to business in Africa. So morals and values for me, that is key.
Jacko, that's an interesting point you made. I mean, you said that obviously the corruption and the fraud that goes on in the public sector and amongst politicians, etc., that is easy to detect. But what do you think about underlying corruption that takes place in the private sector behind closed doors, which is not usually easy to detect unless it is huge in size? Is that not a bigger problem?
I agree with you. It takes two to tango. So corruption is not only driven by the politicians and the public sector. There's a lot of corruption being driven by the private sector, and I support your stance in that. Is it more difficult to detect if you've got people that's trained and you've got the necessary systems and policies and procedures in place? It should not be difficult to detect. We've been training a lot on detection of corrupt activities. We actually wrote a specific legislation in South Africa. We've got 3 or 4 acts that actually deals with it. In South Africa, it's a thing. If you're caught in corruption case, you can get as much as 15 years a sentence. So there's a lot that we do, and unfortunately, policing is for us a problem that we don't have the capacity to do that. But that being said, private sector is getting more and more involved in fighting corruption. We've seen legislation actually now take on directors and companies, so that if you have not created more awareness within your organization that corruption will not be tolerated, you can go to jail. So there's a lot of things happening that actually drives the speaking out against corruption. There's a lot of things, and I've listened to what Paul indicated. There's a lot of new tools that now that becomes more readily available in Africa. AI is an example. That helps us to detect and to become more preventative. Globally, we're working as a professional body towards a 80-20 ratio, 80% preventative, 20% reactive. There's a lot of push in Africa now to do things right and to actually stand out. And from my point of view, having traveled globally all over, I can tell you in South Africa, we've got some of the best fraud examiners in the world. Because we've seen everything, we are exposed to all the different types. Where others work in silos, we are able to look at anything from a normal insurance claim that's overstated right through to financial investigations. So we are going after those that's corrupt. Steinhoff is a very good case where the CEO unfortunately committed suicide when we went after him, Marcus Jooste. But there's plenty of cases that have proven that we don't tolerate it, and we're not going to tolerate it. And yes, even through political influence, just have a look at the newspapers for the last 2-3 days, how many ministers and even our president has been taken on in parliament for corruption. So both public, private sector playing a role, and I think that they need to stop talking about it and speaking out against it and start practicing what they speak, and also guiding those that work for them so that they can see that both public and private sector is serious about this.
Thank you so much, Jaco. We've been talking for quite a while now, and I just wonder if I can bring Paul in for some final thoughts about, what more can be done, how better can we drive this and make improvements. I'm hearing from Jaco that very much starts with the individual and, right from babies upwards. But what's your take on it, Paul? Just a few kind of closing thoughts from you, please.
Thank you so much, Liz. So let me pick up from Jaco. I think this is extremely important, what you're pointing out, Jaco, on the combating of corruption side, beginning with the investigations, the fraud investigations, and then bringing law enforcement in to complete that cycle. So perhaps my comments would be before that on the prevention side, and also for providers like insurers and companies like insurers. There is a role there that perhaps is good to highlight here. That on the prevention side, one of our struggles is that we do have good laws in a number of jurisdictions, and they have been put together excellently with all the right mechanisms, with going across borders to learn from those that are doing it well. And then we have the laws in place. But where companies, where suppliers like insurers perhaps could make a contribution in a unique way is in the arena of compliance. So in terms of having clients, providing services to a client, there is a lot of due diligence that happens, and it is quite possible to decline services to people companies, legal persons that have not passed that. Rather than just increase premiums or make it difficult, one could actually say, we will not work with these types of companies, because it also presents a risk should regulators come in and check whether this was the right process and the right client to work with. So on the compliance side, on the right checks, the due diligence, the enhanced due diligence, there is a role there that could bring in a little bit of a changer. And also in agreement, if a number of providers all agreed that this particular company is too hot for us to provide services to, and it goes round that this company is too hot, then of course that such companies will begin to rethink whether they will get services services from insurers, those who have to meet their own internal mechanisms before they provide such services.
Thank you so much. Uday, we've been having a great conversation. We have probably run out of time for today. Can I hand over to you just to say goodbye?
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Jacqueline, for giving us your expert insight and clarifications of a very huge problem, which is not an African problem, it's a global problem. And I also want to thank our wider audience for joining us today. And remember, at Africa Ascending, we ask the difficult questions in the hope of finding long-term solutions. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us.